Average Joe was excited to receive an invitation from his friends, Corbin and Hickory, to a barbecue party in the local park. He hadn't seen them in months and was looking forward to catching up and enjoying some good food. As he made his way to the park, he couldn't help but feel a bit uneasy. The park was known to be a popular spot for picnics and barbecues, but there were also rumors of a forbidden section of the park that was off limits to the public. According to local legend, this section of the park was home to an ancient barbecue pit that had been used for centuries by a group of cannibalistic cultists. Despite the rumors, Average Joe brushed them off and continued on his way to the designated meeting spot. As he arrived, he was greeted by the familiar faces of Corbin and Hickory, who had already set up a makeshift barbecue pit. The three friends spent the afternoon cooking and eating, reminiscing about old times and catching up on each other's lives. As the sun began to set, they decided to explore the nearby woods, hoping to find some firewood for the pit. As they walked deeper into the woods, they stumbled upon a clearing they had never seen before. In the center of the clearing was an old stone pit, its edges charred black from years of use. "Holy shit, could this be the legendary barbecue pit?" Corbin asked, his eyes wide with excitement. "I don't know, man. This place gives me the creeps," Hickory replied, his voice shaky. Average Joe couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as he looked at the ancient pit. It was clear that this was no ordinary barbecue pit. There was something sinister about it, something that made his skin crawl. "Come on, guys, let's not get spooked by some old barbecue pit. Let's just gather some wood and head back to camp," Average Joe said, trying to ease their nerves. As they began to gather wood, strange things started to happen. The wind picked up, causing the trees to rustle and creak. The birds that had been chirping just moments before fell silent, leaving the woods eerily quiet. Suddenly, they heard a loud crackling sound, like branches snapping underfoot. They turned around to see a dark figure emerging from the woods, its eyes glowing red in the fading light. "Guys, we need to get out of here, now!" Average Joe shouted, his heart pounding in his chest. But it was too late. The ancient entity had already spotted them, and it was hungry. As they ran back to camp, they could hear the creature's footsteps getting closer and closer, its raspy breaths echoing through the woods. Finally, they burst through the tree line and into the safety of their camp. They quickly packed up their belongings and fled the park, vowing never to return again. Little did they know, the ancient entity had marked them as its next victims, and it would stop at nothing to consume their souls as they feasted on their meat. Average Joe couldn't shake the feeling that something was off after their encounter with the ancient entity in the woods. Despite their vow to never return to the park, he found himself drawn back to the location, unable to resist the lure of the forbidden barbecue pit. He decided to investigate the history of the pit, hoping to uncover some answers about the entity that had pursued them. He spent hours researching and speaking to locals, but no one seemed to know anything about the dark history of the pit. Frustrated and exhausted, Average Joe finally decided to head to bed. But as he drifted off to sleep, he was haunted by vivid nightmares of the ancient entity stalking him through the woods, its glowing red eyes fixed on him. The next morning, he woke up feeling groggy and disoriented. As he made his way to the kitchen, he noticed that his reflection in the mirror seemed different somehow. His eyes were dark and sunken, and there were dark circles under them. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Over the next few days, strange things started happening to Average Joe. Objects in his home would move on their own, and he would hear strange noises coming from his attic. He tried to ignore the strange occurrences, but they only seemed to escalate, culminating in a terrifying encounter with the ancient entity. One night, as Average Joe was getting ready for bed, he heard a loud banging coming from his front door. When he opened the door, he was confronted by the ancient entity, its eyes glowing bright red in the darkness. Average Joe tried to slam the door shut, but the entity was too strong. It burst into his home, knocking him to the ground. As it loomed over him, Average Joe could feel its hot breath on his face, and he knew that he was facing certain death. Just as the entity was about to consume him, Average Joe woke up. It had all been a terrible nightmare, or so he thought. But as he looked around his room, he noticed that things were not as they should be. The room was covered in soot and ash, and the smell of burning wood filled the air. He soon realized that the ancient entity had followed him into his dreams and left a haunting reminder of its power. Average Joe knew that he needed to put an end to the entity's hold on him before it was too late. But how could he defeat a creature that had existed for centuries and had already consumed countless souls? He decided to seek out the help of Corbin and Hickory, hoping that together they could uncover the secrets of the forbidden barbecue pit and put an end to the ancient entity's reign of terror. Average Joe met up with Corbin and Hickory at a local diner to discuss their plan to defeat the ancient entity that had been haunting them. They huddled around a booth, sipping coffee as they discussed their next steps. "We need to figure out what the hell that thing is and how to get rid of it," Corbin said, his voice low and serious. Hickory nodded in agreement. "I heard rumors about that barbecue pit being cursed," he said. "Some folks say it was used for sacrifices and other dark rituals." Average Joe shuddered at the thought. "We need to find out more," he said. "We need to know everything we can about that pit and the entity that haunts it." The trio spent the next few days scouring the town for any information they could find about the forbidden barbecue pit. They spoke to old-timers who remembered the pit from their youth and even visited the local library to search through old newspaper archives. Finally, they stumbled upon an old book in the library's archives that described the history of the pit. According to the book, the pit was built by a group of settlers who had come to the area in the early 1800s. They had used the pit to cook food for their community gatherings, but over time, the pit had become a site of dark and twisted rituals. The settlers had begun sacrificing animals and even other humans to appease a mysterious entity that they believed lived in the woods nearby. The entity was said to have glowing red eyes and a hunger that could never be satisfied. As Average Joe read the book, he felt a chill run down his spine. Could the entity that they had encountered in the woods be the same one that the settlers had worshipped? Determined to find out, the trio set out to the park once again, armed with everything they needed to perform a ritual that they hoped would reveal the truth about the entity. They gathered around the forbidden barbecue pit, holding hands as they recited an incantation that they had found in the old book. As they spoke the words, the pit began to glow, and the ground beneath them shook. Suddenly, the ground opened up beneath them, and they found themselves falling into a dark abyss. They tumbled down into a cavernous underground chamber, lit only by the glowing embers of the pit. In the center of the chamber, they saw a grotesque and twisted creature, with glowing red eyes and sharp teeth. It let out a blood-curdling scream as it lunged towards them. The trio fought back, armed with nothing but their wits and their determination to rid the town of the ancient entity's curse. They dodged its attacks and managed to trap it in a circle of salt, just as the incantation had instructed. The entity screamed and writhed, trying to break free, but the circle held fast. Finally, it let out a final pitiful moan and disappeared in a puff of smoke. The trio emerged from the underground chamber, exhausted but triumphant. They had succeeded in defeating the ancient entity that had haunted their town for centuries. As they made their way back to the surface, they saw that the park had been transformed. The trees were lush and green, and the air was filled with the sweet smell of flowers. It was as if the ancient entity had been holding the town in its grip. But now that it was gone, life could flourish once again. As they walked away from the park, Average Joe couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The nightmare was over, and they had succeeded in banishing the dark and sinister presence that had haunted their town for generations. Average Joe and Corbin stood at the edge of the barbecue pit, peering down into the darkness. They had come to the park together, both still reeling from the events of the past few days. As they looked into the pit, they saw something that made their blood run cold. It wasn't ash or charcoal at the bottom of the pit, but rather a pile of human bones. They were stacked haphazardly, as if they had been tossed in without care. Corbin broke the silence, his voice trembling with fear. "We didn't defeat the entity, Joe. We just banished it for a while. It's been feeding on the town for years, using the pit as a portal to our world." Average Joe felt sick to his stomach as he realized the truth. The entity wasn't just a cursed presence, it was a malevolent force that had been manipulating their town for centuries. He looked around, taking in the park, the trees, the sky. It all seemed tainted now, as if he was seeing the world in a new light. But there was something else that caught his eye. In the distance, he could see a figure standing in the shadows. It was a tall, thin figure, with long arms that hung down to its knees. It seemed to be watching them, silently waiting. "Corbin, do you see that?" Average Joe whispered, pointing towards the figure. Corbin nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "We have to go, Joe, now!" As they turned to leave, Average Joe heard a voice in his head. It was the same voice that had spoken to him before, but now it was clearer, more insistent. It whispered to him, promising power, promising control. Average Joe felt a surge of temptation, but he shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. He knew that he couldn't give in to the entity's influence. As they hurried away from the pit, Average Joe heard a sound behind him. It was a low growl, like an animal in pain. He turned to look, but there was nothing there. When they got back to Corbin's car, Average Joe felt a sense of relief wash over him. They had made it out alive, and they had banished the entity once more. But as he looked back toward the park, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had only scratched the surface of the horrors that lurked there. As they drove away, Average Joe couldn't help but wonder if they had truly defeated the entity, or if it was just biding its time, waiting for its next opportunity to strike. Hey there, everyone! As we come to the end of this spine-tingling barbecue horror story, I just wanted to take a moment to thank each and every one of you for tuning in and listening to my tale. Your support and attention mean a lot to me, and I'm glad that I could share this story with all of you. I hope it left you feeling a bit scared and on edge, but also entertained and engaged. I also want to remind you all to be careful and aware of your surroundings, even in places that you might consider safe and familiar. You never know what could be lurking just around the corner. Thanks again for listening, and I hope you'll join me for more spooky stories in the future. Your host, Average Joe.